News that the centre of American capitalism is engaged in negotiations has caused a stir on Wall Street, and there's speculation that further matchups could follow. Well, our correspondent Paul Brennan joins us from London now. Paul, what exactly would a merger mean?
Well, I mean, we talk about merger, but it could very well easily be described as a takeover more than anything else. According to a joint statement that's been put out by the Deutsche Börse and the New York Stock Exchange, we're talking about the Deutsche owning 60% of any new firm and the New York Stock Exchange shareholders owning about 40%. So you can see it is heavily weighted in favour of the German side of the deal. What it would create, though, is the world's largest stock exchange firm, certainly by profits and revenue anyway. One thing to be aware of, though, is that it's not a done deal just yet. I mean, the Deutsche Börse does have a history of trying to do deals such as this, merger deals, and they're not always successful. The New York Stock Exchange and Deutsche Börse held merger talks twice before, in 2008 and 2009. They came to nothing. Those talks resumed again late last year. And although it is looking far more likely that they will come to fruition this time, it's still not a done deal. So there is a degree of caution.
Yeah, causing a huge buzz on Wall Street, though, because I guess as far as they're concerned, New York is the centre of the financial universe. What kind of wider reaction is this going to have?
Well, wider reaction, I have to say, is almost one of inevitability. I mean, the announcement yesterday did overshadow somewhat the other big announcement from yesterday, which was that the London Stock Exchange is to merge with the Toronto Stock Exchange, the TMX Group. Now that's just one of several big stock exchange mergers which has taken place in recent years. The fact is that deals are less likely now to be done on the floor of the stock exchanges, as we see the pictures there. There's barely 1,300 people now actually working on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. That's down from around 3,000 just 10 years ago. Deals more likely to be done on computer screens out in Jersey City or Kansas now than they are to be done actually in those formerly big financial centres. So what the stock exchanges are doing is banding together for speed. It means they can invest more in technology. It means their capacity increases, and it also gives them global reach. So the old-fashioned way of doing business is frankly on the way out. And certainly, although New York City, the mayor, for example, is not particularly happy that the New York Stock Exchange will lose some of its power, traders certainly see this as inevitable.
Yeah, some interesting changes ahead. Paul, thanks for that. Paul Brennan in London there. Now, the Philippines government has resumed peace talks with Muslim separatists for the first time since President Benigno Aquino took office last year. The decades-long conflict in the country's south has pitted government forces against rebels from the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. More than 120,000 people have been killed and up to 2 million displaced in the rebellion. North Korea is refusing to hold any more talks with South Korea, saying Seoul wasn't serious about improving relations. 2 days of dialogue between military leaders broke down on Wednesday as neither side could agree on an agenda for future discussions. Tensions have been high on the peninsula since the North shelled a South Korean island in November, killing 4 people. Harry Fawcett has the latest from Seoul.
Well, certainly the statement from the North Korean side seems pretty uncompromising. It reads, "Our military and people do not feel the need to meet the traitors group." I'm told the nuance of that is that they don't even want to associate with South Korea at the moment, as long as they, South Korea, don't want improved North-South ties and refuse dialogue. Now, even given the strength of that statement, I think it's a little bit early to call time entirely on this process, if nothing else because North Korea has a very recent track record of completely changing its position. In December, the language coming from Pyongyang was extremely belligerent, even raising the spectre of nuclear war. But since the beginning of January, there have been repeated calls, a clamour really, for talks. And certainly the South Korean side says the door to further conversation is open if the North agrees to the agenda and the level of representation. Now, the reference there is to the 2 key issues which saw the ending of these talks. Firstly, the agenda being what South Korea wants to talk about, the sinking of the Cheonan in March last year with a loss of 46 lives, the South Korean military vessel, and the attack in November on Yongpyong Island by North Korean artillery in which 4 people were killed. Now, both sides knew the position of the other, the North saying that it had nothing to do with the Cheonan vessel and that it wants to have much wider discussions about security on the peninsula. The South really needing some kind of acknowledgement of responsibility, if not an apology from the North. So with those positions so far apart, even if low-level military talks do start again, despite this North Korean statement, there seems little chance of agreement and further talks, higher level or six-party talks taking place.
In Colombia, the first of 5 hostages set to be released by FARC rebels has been freed. 35-year-old local politician Marcos Baquero was flown to safety on a Brazilian helicopter on Wednesday. He was kidnapped by the FARC in June 2009. Around 20 political hostages remain in FARC custody. The US says it would be an unfortunate distraction if former Haitian President Jean-Bertrand Aristide returned to the country before next month's presidential runoff. On Tuesday, Aristide's lawyer collected a passport for the former leader, will return to Haiti. And another former Haitian leader missed a court appearance on Wednesday instead paying a visit to his doctor. Jean-Claude Duvalier's lawyer said the former president was complaining of neck pain to respond to allegations of corruption, embezzlement and misappropriation of funds during his presidency. Now, on Wednesday, the Mexican army celebrated what it claimed to be the rescue of dozens of migrants held hostage by drug traffickers. But 24 hours later, it appears they weren't hostages after all. Frank Contreras has the story from Mexico City.
A potential political embarrassment for Mexico. On Tuesday, Mexico's army triumphantly announced it had released Guatemalan. In a news release, the army said the men were being held against their will in a safe house allegedly belonging to drug traffickers. But hours later, in an unusual move, a spokeswoman for the Guatemalan Foreign Ministry told reporters that the migrants apparently were not kidnapped. And later, in a news release, the Guatemalan Foreign Ministry referred to the incident as a rescue operation. It's unclear whether Mexican security forces were caught in the act of trying to play up their crime-fighting role for political purposes, or whether this was simply an honest mistake. In any case, immigrants' rights organizations say this points to a complete lack of coordination. A better approach, they argue, would be to integrate immigration policy throughout the region.
El fenómeno migratorio es un fenómeno regional.
Migration is a regional phenomenon. The Mexican, Central American and U.S. governments are all involved, but all of them are working on it on their own. This has to change. We have to start working together.
The incident comes amid rising tensions between Mexico and its Central American neighbors, whose government officials argue Mexico is not doing enough to protect immigrants from harm. The most violent incident occurred in October, when 72 immigrants were massacred. Mexican police blame it on a violent mafia organization called the Zetas. Central American governments quickly demanded that Mexico do more to protect immigrants crossing its national territory. According to Mexican authorities, some 20,000 undocumented immigrants were kidnapped by criminal organizations in 2010. Tuesday's official revelation from Guatemalan authorities will most likely add to the diplomatic tensions. But the real dangers facing tens of thousands of immigrants heading through Mexico on their way north will not likely stop them from making the journey. Frank Contreras, Al Jazeera, Mexico City.
Hello there, I'm Shili Ghosh with the headlines here on Al Jazeera. Mass protests are continuing in Egypt for a 17th day. Thousands more workers are expected to go on strike, looking for pay rises and government reforms. Negotiations for a transition of power are still underway, but with no notable progress so far. Hundreds of anti-Mubarak demonstrators are also camped outside the country's parliament. Gatherings outside government buildings are usually banned in Egypt, but the army is allowing people access. Meanwhile, Egypt's newly appointed culture minister has quit. His family says it's due to health reasons, but Egypt's Al-Ahram newspaper says Gaba Asfour, who's also a writer, was criticised by his colleagues for taking the post. He was the only new face in the new cabinet. In other news, a suicide bomber in school uniform has attacked a military base in Pakistan, killing at least 30 troops. It happened in the town of Mardan in northwest Pakistan. The attack came early on Thursday as army cadets were doing their morning training. At least 18 others were injured. Reports from India suggest the country has formally agreed to resume peace talks with Pakistan. Dialogue was broken off after the 2008 Mumbai attacks, which India blames on Pakistan-based fighters. Pakistan won't confirm the move, but says things have moved forward. The Philippines government has resumed peace talks with Muslim separatists for the first time since President Benigno Aquino took office last year. The decades-long conflict in the country's south has pitted government forces against rebels from the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. More than 120,000 people have been killed, up to 2 million displaced in the rebellion. North Korea has refused to hold any more talks with South Korea, saying Seoul wasn't serious about improving relations. Dialogue between military leaders broke down on Thursday after neither side could agree on an agenda for future discussions. Tensions have been high on the peninsula since the North shelled a South Korean island in November, killing 4 people. And shares have soared more than 15% on the news that the New York Stock Exchange could soon have new owners in Europe. Advanced discussions on a merger are underway with the operator of the Frankfurt Stock Exchange, the Deutsche Börse. News that the centre of American capitalism is engaged in negotiations has caused a stir on Wall Street, and there's speculation that further matchups could follow. Those are the headlines. I'll be back at the top of the hour with a full roundup. Coming up next here on Al Jazeera, it's Inside Story. Do stay with us.
An uprising in Egypt because of a young generation powered by Twitter and Facebook. That's what we're being told, but is it really true? And why did this man, a young Egyptian singer, popular across the Middle East, come out in defence of President Mubarak and then apparently apologise? Today, the young generation and the new Egypt. This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to Inside Story. I'm Sahil Rahman. Social media has been dubbed the new tool for revolutionaries. The seeds were sown in 2009 when Twitter was credited with the protests that followed the Iranian elections. Debate followed the uprising that saw the ousting of Zine El Abidine Ben Ali early this year as to whether it was the first Twitter revolution. And now in Egypt, the role of social media in mobilising the people has once again come into focus. But with many of the protesters on the ground having little or no access to